Welcome to Wellness and Wisdom with me, Dr. Nadu Tuwakli. Here you can expect to hear conversations about everything women over 40 care about. From optimal wellness and peak performance, from intimacy to travel and finances and more. I will be speaking to interesting women and sometimes men to educate and motivate you to live your best life. If you want to find out more, please head over to my website, drtwakli.com, or subscribe to my blog. You can also read my book, Sex, Sanity, and Sleep. We are in this together. Welcome back to Wellness and Wisdom with me, Dr. Nadu Tuwakli. Today, we are talking about the mind-blowing subject of Alzheimer's. And I promise you, your mind will be blown wide open. It's tempting to rush to the bottom line, which is that Alzheimer's actually can be reversed and prevented. Yes, you heard it right, which begs the question, if that's the case, how come everyone doesn't know about it? And how come the doctors don't tell people about it? But we'll get to that later. And how you can join a trial that is ongoing at the moment. And we're going to just cover so much today, so hold on to your seats. Few diseases, including cancer, are as dreaded as Alzheimer's. According to the WHO, globally, the incidence of Alzheimer's disease and other dementias increased by 147% from 1990 to 2019. An estimated 6.7 million Americans are living with Alzheimer's disease, and that figure is expected to double by 2060. 1 in 9 people over 65 suffer from it. The medical costs, the emotional toll are humongous. Now, interestingly enough, there was a recent study done, and it showed that the eastern and southeastern areas of the United States have the highest rates of Alzheimer's disease. In fact, the highest prevalence was found in Maryland, New York, Mississippi, and Florida. And at a county level, Miami-Dade and Baltimore in Maryland, of course. And also in the Bronx, New York. The number of people living with the disease doubles every 5 years after the age of 65. And it is the 6th leading cause of death among US adults. I don't want to give you too much preamble because I really want to get into the topic. And there's so much to talk about. I want to get to the meat of Alzheimer's and why my guest can claim that it might be curable. Yet the Alzheimer's Association and many others have it on their website that it is an incurable disease. Dementia is a term for several diseases that affect memory, thinking, and the ability to perform daily activities. And the assumption is that the illness gets worse over time. Obviously, it mainly affects older people, but not all people will get it as they age. So in 2019, I was at a conference in Miami. It was the last presentation of the day, and this presentation was given by a young lady. She was standing on the stage. She was talking about her Alzheimer's. She was a psychiatrist. She was talking about how 10 years before, she had noticed that she could not drive in reverse and therefore was having difficulty parking her car. When she went to parties, she couldn't understand what everyone was saying and she couldn't follow the jokes. She gradually had more and more decline. So of course, being a doctor, she went to an ear, nose, and throat doctor. She went to a neurologist. She went all over the place. She was told that she had early Alzheimer's. I'm sitting in the audience and I'm looking at her and I'm thinking, am I missing something? This was 10 years ago. And this lady's standing on the stage talking about how she apparently cured her Alzheimer's and actually went back to work. Now, she handed out an article that day that was written by my guest today, Dale Bredesen, MD. This article was printed in 2014, and in it, he claimed that he had reversed the cognitive decline or impairment in 100 patients. So, of course, as a doctor, I was very skeptical, but he gave the data of what their test scores were before and after, and it was rather compelling. So I ended up giving him a call. My guest today is that gentleman, Dr. Dale Bredesen. He is a neuroscience researcher and Singleton Chair in Neurology at the Pacific Neuroscience Institute. He received his undergraduate degree from Caltech and his medical degree from Duke University. He was a faculty member at University of California, LA, then became the founding president and CEO of the Buck Institute for Research on Aging and an adjunct professor at UCSF in 1998. From 2013 to 2023, He returned to UCLA as a professor and director of the Eastern Center for Alzheimer's Disease Research. He is currently senior director of the world's first precision medicine program for neurodegenerative diseases, and his lab and institute have published over 200 research papers. So his group has developed a new approach to the treatment of Alzheimer's disease that they call RECODE, RECODE, for early Alzheimer's disease. Dr. Bredesen is the author of 2 New York Times bestsellers, The End of Alzheimer's Program to Prevent and Reverse Cognitive Decline, and The End of Alzheimer's Program. It's amazing, but first, let's talk about how we get to the point of a possible cure. Dr. Bredesen, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Dr. Twalkley. Thanks very much for the invitation.
So, you say in your book that Alzheimer's is worse than fatal. What do you say to patients who go to their doctors complaining of decreased memory, but the doctor says, oh, you seem fine, runs a whole bunch of tests and says, come back next year. And then the following year, you're told that you actually do indeed have Alzheimer's, but there's nothing that can be done. What do you say to a patient like that?
Yeah, it's a great point because it happens every day, as you know. For all complex chronic illnesses, and you can talk about cancer, you can talk about heart disease, you can talk about neurodegenerative diseases, Alzheimer's, ALS, all of these things, you want to get in as early as possible. Of course, you don't want to wait until you have widely metastatic cancer to be treated for cancer. So just as over the years, physicians have developed better ways for screening for early cancers, we'd like to do the same thing for people who have cognitive decline and cognitive changes. So we recommend that everybody who is 40 years of age or older get a cognoscopy. Just as you know, you should get a colonoscopy when you turn 50. And by the way, my wife and I had his and hers colonoscopies on Valentine's Day. We just wanted to get it out of the way. And so everyone should have a cognoscopy because this looks at where your brain stands. It gives you some key blood tests that are not being done by most physicians. Some online cognitive assessment that only takes about 20 to 30 minutes. And then if you have symptoms, you want to also include an MRI with volumetrics. If no symptoms and you're just there for prevention, you don't need to include that. The problem, as you indicated, is that doctors say, oh, this is just normal aging. Come back next year, come back next year. And then after this happens several times, they say, oh, wait a minute. You do have Alzheimer's. There's nothing I can do about it. You're going to die. That is barbaric. And especially with what we know now, we can reverse cognitive decline and prevent cognitive decline in the vast majority of people.
Now, is there an age at which cognitive impairment cannot be reversed?
No, we've had people into their 90s who actually improve their cognition. Now, to be fair, they don't necessarily come all the way back to perfect, but they come to be better than they are, which again is something that just hadn't been seen before our first paper that you mentioned in 2014. We published the first examples of reversal of cognitive decline in patients with Alzheimer's disease.
So if people feel like they're constantly got the word on the tip of the tongue, but can't quite find it, or senior moments, or fog, they should be evaluated.
Absolutely. And look, so if you go in and you're evaluated and it turns out, hey, you don't have Alzheimer's, you still want to improve your memory. Something is wrong, something that brought you there. And it may be something else. Might be vascular, for example. So you want to address that. There are several other things that, as you alluded to earlier, it could be, it could be Lewy body disease, for example, or frontotemporal dementia. So you want to know these things and improve them. And again, if this is early Alzheimer's, then you want to be able to treat it early. So when you develop Alzheimer's disease, you actually go through 4 phases. And Alzheimer's, as you know, is a pathology. It means that when the pathologist looks in your brain, you have some amyloid plaques, you have some neurofibrillary tangles, which are full of phosphorylated tau, a molecule that's basically there as a stabilizing molecule. That's being pulled off. The stability is lost. You're pulling back on your connections. And you have some inflammation typically, and you have some loss of synapses. That's what the pathologist calls Alzheimer's disease. When you develop this, you go through a phase where you are asymptomatic. You can still pick up early, and this is even true for some people in their 20s and 30s. You can pick up changes in PET scans, but you're still asymptomatic. Then the second
Mm.
phase is called SCI, subjective cognitive impairment. You know there's something wrong. Often your spouse will know that there's something wrong, but you're still able to score normally on standardized cognitive testing. That lasts on average 10 years. So we have a tremendous opportunity to reverse your cognitive decline. Those people tend, virtually 100% of them tend to come back to normal. The third of four phases is called mild cognitive impairment. So it's like telling someone with cancer, don't worry, you only have mildly metastatic cancer. It's a late stage of what is Alzheimer's disease. And by definition, that means now you're not scoring normally on cognitive tests, but you can still take care of yourself. You can still do your activities of daily living. When you start to lose those, you cross over into the fourth phase, which is dementia. So the idea is if we can get everyone to come in on the first two phases, it would be very rare to see the third and fourth phases. So that's the goal.
So would you say that Alzheimer's is just a chemical process that results in structural changes in the brain?
That's a very good way to put it. What we discovered is that the current view of Alzheimer's, the classical view, is incomplete. So, as you know,
Okay.
it's been thought to be it's about you make amyloid, it's about you have
Amyloid.
misfolded proteins, things like that. Well, what are they doing there? Why are you making the amyloid? It turns out to be very interesting. Amyloid is part of your innate immune system. So when your brain is invaded, for example, by bacteria from your mouth, which happens all the time, so P. gingivalis from periodontitis actually gets in your brain. That's well documented. And your brain, what does it do? It tries to protect itself. It produces amyloid that sequesters, literally wraps around the bacteria and kills them. It is an antimicrobial peptide. And your body has other antimicrobial peptides, but amyloid is one of them. And so when we look at these brains and say, aha, you got Alzheimer's because of amyloid, no, you made the amyloid because your brain was insulted, in this case by pathogens. And this can happen with spirochetes and bacteria and fungi and viruses, all sorts of these things. Your brain makes this as part of its protective response.
Now, what things increase the risk of developing dementia?
Yeah, great point. So, the model that we came to after 30 years of research is that what we call Alzheimer's is really a network insufficiency. When you look at a brain of someone with Alzheimer's, what you see is amyloid and you see tau and you see synapse loss and inflammation. And so it looks like the amyloid is causing the problem, but it's actually a beautiful protective approach to this. When you get various infections in your brain, part of your innate immune system is to make this amyloid that coats them and kills them. And the two things that drive this, the two major things, are reduction in energetics and an increase in inflammation. So you can immediately see the things that are going to give you that risk. So, sedentary lifestyle, poor vascular flow, so poor blood flow, poor mitochondrial function, sleep apnea, which reduces the oxygenation. Anything that drives your energetics down is going to increase your risk. On the other hand, anything that increases inflammation, so changes in your oral microbiome, changes in your gut microbiome, systemic inflammation, for example, all of these things that are inflammatory will drive this. Those are the major players. So some of the kind of everyday things that we are concerned about, I mentioned sleep apnea, changes in the oral microbiome, insulin resistance, because having that insulin resistance and pre-diabetes and ultimately type 2 diabetes, that has both of the effects. It reduces your support for the brain because of the resistance to insulin, but it also increases the inflammation because you are glycating these proteins, just like we measure it as hemoglobin A1C. But remember that hundreds of proteins have that glycated change. So the glucose, just like remoras on a shark, the glucose is sticking to these various proteins and changing their function, structure, and inflammatory capability. So you really have kind of the worst of both worlds when you have type 2 diabetes and pre-diabetes. So these are some of the most common things that increases risk. And of course, I should mention menopause and andropause. Now, with menopause, there is a more rapid change in hormones, and that's believed to be why there is a greater increased risk with menopause than with andropause. With andropause, it's a little slower. You still have an increased risk, but you don't have quite as rapid of a drop off. And I should mention, when I was training, which is way back in the 1980s, we never saw people in their 40s and 50s with Alzheimer's disease. This was considered a disease of your 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Now we know you can see the changes, as I mentioned earlier, 20s and 30s, but we very commonly see people present very symptomatically in their early 50s. It's one of the most common things we see. And those people tend to have their Alzheimer's in association with exposure to a lot of toxins. And this can be airborne, things like air pollution. They can be inorganics, things like mercury, or they can be organics, things like benzene, toluene, glyphosate, or it can be biotoxins, things like toxins from molds, things like trichothecenes and ochratoxin A and gliotoxin. All of these things can contribute because, of course, these reduce your energetics and increase your inflammation. Anything that has that impact is a risk for cognitive decline associated with Alzheimer's.
Now, can you say a couple of words about the APOE3 and 4?
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up because it's the most common genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. So if you have no copies of APOE4, so you can have 0, 1, or 2. You get it from your mother and father. You can have 0. You can have 1 that you got from your mother or your father, or you may have gotten 1 from your mother and 1 from your father. So we want to know about APOE4. Typically, people have 1 of 3. It's APOE2, 3, or 4. So for example, I checked myself. I'm an APOE3. That's the most common. 3/4 of the population has no APOE4. Our risk for cognitive decline over our lifetime is about 9%. It's not 0, but it's not too high. If you have a single copy, and that's 75 million Americans, then your risk is 30% during your lifetime, which is why we think it's so important. Everybody should know their status and just get on active prevention, no problem. If you have 2 copies, and that's 7 million Americans, your risk is about 70%. Most likely you will develop Alzheimer's during your lifetime. So again, please get checked early. Get on active prevention. Don't worry about it. As I've explained to our daughters who are now in their 30s, you are the first generation that does not have to worry about Alzheimer's disease. This was a huge issue for my generation. This is no longer a big problem.
So interestingly enough, I was talking with a colleague of mine the other day. She's an internist. And I told her about your program and the fact that people are reversing their cognitive decline. She told me, she said, I never send anyone to get the APOE test because I feel like I have them do the test and then I have to give them bad news and say, guess what? You have the gene for Alzheimer's and there's nothing that can be done. So even as a physician, she chooses not to even test it because she believes that it doesn't make any difference. It only makes you depressed.
That's the common approach, and it's now outdated because there's a tremendous amount you can do. I would encourage her and everyone to check out a website which is called apoe4.info. And this was started by Julie G., who is a woman who herself is APOE4. She found in her late 40s, she was struggling and had some cognitive decline. She tested at the 35th percentile for her age. By the way, she's now at 98th percentile and doing absolutely great, over 10 years into treatment. And so she was just desperate, looking for anything that could be done. And so she founded this website and they share information, and there are over 7,000 people on there. So please check that and talk to some of the people there about why did they check their own APOE status and what are they doing. The vast majority of them are on some variation of the protocol we developed, the RECODE that you mentioned.
So in your book, you mentioned that there are 3 types of Alzheimer's. And can you tell us the difference between the 3 types?
Great point.
It's not a single disease.
6. Yeah, so we now know about 6 types. So,
Okay.
so the idea was We understand now more and more that Alzheimer's is a response. It is you are responding to insults, to reduced blood flow, to sleep apnea, to change in your oral microbiome, to herpes simplex, for example. That's one of the things that you respond to with amyloid. The question was, could we now begin to look at what is causing this problem? And what we found is that there are people who have, it's mostly an inflammatory driver. That's the main thing that's driving there. So we called that type 1 inflammatory. Then there's type 2, which is completely different, atrophic. You just don't have enough trophic support. Estradiol, progesterone, pregnenolone, testosterone, vitamin D, B12, nerve growth factor, BDNF, all these things that help that remarkable neural network you have inside your skull to function at its best. When the loss of those causes cognitive decline, we call that type 2 or atrophic Alzheimer's. Then there's one which has some of both, features of both, and so we called that type 1.5. That's glycotoxic. You have the insulin resistance, which causes some type 2, but you also have the glycated inflammatory proteins, which causes the type 1. So that's type 1.5, which is glycotoxic. Then there's type 3, which is toxic, as I mentioned earlier, inorganics, organics, and biotoxins. They all can cause this problem. Type 4 is vascular. Reduced blood flow is a common problem here. And then type 5, the last one, is traumatic. And so, yes, if you've had repeated head trauma, you are at increased risk for both Alzheimer's and for CTE. So those are the different types. And of course, you treat them differently. So this is a precision medicine approach that we take. We look for the drivers for each person, and then we address those drivers.
So that was my next question. Why do we need a programmatic approach to curing and preventing Alzheimer's as opposed to keep looking for a single pill?
It's a great point. And of course, we all want the best outcomes. I hope there will be a single pill one day. But as I've often shown at lectures, if you had a single pill to treat everybody, it would have to do about 75 different things. So that's a lot to expect from a single pill. I do think there will be pills that will be very helpful in addition to personalized protocols. But what you really want to do is, for each person, identify the drivers of the cognitive decline, address those drivers. For example, some people will do better if they have a CPAP machine for their sleep apnea. Some people don't need that, of course. Some people need improvement in their oral microbiome. They've got some periodontitis-related organisms. Some don't. Some people have a leaky gut. Some don't. Some people have chronic Lyme infection or other tick-borne infection. Some don't. So you have to go after the drivers. By the way, there was an interesting study, a trial that actually failed, where they were using a drug that was against a protease, a specific enzyme made by P. gingivalis. It's called gingipain for that reason. And what they found was, for overall, it failed. But if they took the people that didn't have any evidence of P. gingivalis and took them out, if you have no evidence, why are you going after that? And they just left the ones that did have evidence of that. Then they actually saw a slowing of decline. Now, unfortunately, they didn't see an improvement, which is the goal, and that's what we're seeing. We see actually improvement and sustained. We now have people over 10 years with sustained improvement. But it was very clear that this drug they developed was working on the people that actually had the P. gingivalis.
The people that didn't get their twice a year dental cleaning, those are the folks.
Yeah,
So
it's oral
listen
microbiome
hard.
is important. Yeah.
So we used to say that Alzheimer's was a postmortem diagnosis, but
Yes.
now we can make the diagnosis in vivo. Can we make a definitive diagnosis, and how?
Absolutely. And this is a great topic to discuss because blood tests have just come out that are very helpful. Now, up until just recently, the way to do this pre-mortem was with a PET scan or a spinal tap. And of course, most people would prefer not to have spinal tap, especially to have repeated spinal taps over the years. The good news is there are now several tests very helpful. So there's one called p-tau 217, another one called p-tau 181. And what these are measuring, so this is P is for phosphorylated tau. This is a really interesting story because in your brain, you've got this constant plasticity going on. You're learning things all the time. You're remembering where your keys are. You're remembering where you are, what you're supposed to do later, all that stuff. So you've got this just amazing system going on all the time. Now, when you are putting out these neurites, you are connecting with various other neurons. These things have a structural element, which is the microtubules, and you use tau as bolts. Literally, the tau bolts these things into place. So now you've got these nice, strong connections. Well, guess what happens? Now you start lowering the energetics, increasing the inflammation, and now what happens is you need to pull these back. You can no longer sustain them. And therefore, you phosphorylate the tau, which changes its shape and that drops off the tubules. So it's a quick way to pull back. Now, the good news is you can measure that in the blood now. So you can see to what extent is my brain pulling back. And there are those 217 and 181 are the ones that are specific for Alzheimer's as a process. You can then get other tests, such as neurofilament light, to say, well, is there anything that's causing damage to my neurons? So when you put these together, you have a really nice look. You can get the p-tau to tell you if you have Alzheimer's. And again, don't worry if it's high. You find out early, you get in, you can do a lot about it, and you can actually follow your p-tau right back down again. The neurofilament light will tell you, is there anything causing neuronal damage? And then there's a third one called GFAP, glial fibrillary acidic protein. And that is actually showing you, do I have a response from my glial cells, essentially an inflammatory type of response. So 3 different types of information. There's a fourth test, which is A beta 42:40 ratio. So this is the amyloid. It's literally measuring 2 different types of amyloid, 42 and 40, in your blood and looking at the ratio. The ratio changes slightly, but it does change when you're getting Alzheimer's disease, and that can be measured. And it's a relatively early change. Again, you can see, pick this up early and do something about it. This is the future. Just as, 60 years ago, people were saying we should all be measuring our cholesterol. And we've understood, better and better about what are the critical lipids that are associated with vascular disease. This is the same story now for neurodegenerative disease. So you can now measure these various things in the blood. We should all know our status and get treated if appropriate.
So I'm going to come back to what tests are necessary to show what is contributing to Alzheimer's in a given individual. But before we do that, what are the early signs of dementia?
Such a good point, because when you develop dementia, of course, dementia is the fourth phase. That's the final one. The early signs you want to look for are grouped into 2 groups, amnestic, non-amnestic. So in about 2/3 of people or so, the early ones are about new memory, short-term memory. So you're saying, well, wait a minute, what did I have for breakfast this morning? Or you're saying, where did I put my keys? Or where did I park my car? Those sorts of things are common, as you know. Some of the people will tell me, I went to dinner with my spouse last night and he or she asked me the same question at the beginning of dinner, in the middle of dinner, and at the end of dinner. That's the sort of thing that's concerning. Then about 1/3 of people will have non-amnestic presentations, and those tend to be problems with navigation. They'll get lost often, as you know. There'll be problems with naming, coming up with the right word. There'll be problems with visual perception, often not recognizing faces. Problems with planning, so-called executive dysfunction. All those sorts of things, all of those are non-amnestic presentations for Alzheimer's disease. So, word finding and facial recognition, all these things. And even ultimately things like getting things backwards and deciding, how to dress, calling things the wrong name, things like that. Those are some of the early symptoms. And if those happen to you, please don't let your doctor tell you this is a normal part of aging. You can do much better. And now there is the ability. In the past, it was like, well, we can't do anything about Alzheimer's anyway, so we'll just assume that it's not Alzheimer's.
We understand that we want to attack the root cause of the problem before it gets embedded, ideally.
Yes.
So what other tests are necessary to show what is contributing to a particular individual's Alzheimer's?
Yes. So earlier we talked about the tests that tell you whether you have it. And that's like p-tau. Now, as you said, we want to know why you have it or why you are at risk. Are you at high risk or low risk? And so it goes back to what are the things that drive it. So we want to know, do you have any ongoing systemic inflammation? So simple things like HSCRP, albumin to globulin ratio. Some people also like to look at TNF alpha and things like that. These are markers of inflammation. Then secondly, markers of glucose metabolism that is suboptimal. So that's literally HOMA-IR, which is a look at your insulin resistance. So you want to know fasting glucose, hemoglobin A1C, and fasting insulin. And if there's any question or if they're your borderline, consider a glucose tolerance test with insulin. So you're evaluating the insulin as well. As you know, doing continuous glucose monitoring, CGMs, so many people are doing that and finding those very helpful for seeing when are you going up too much, when are you coming down. Both of those, going up too much and coming down too far, are definitely risk factors for cognitive decline. So we look at those parameters. Then we look at the ones that contribute to the atrophic form. So we're looking at, as I mentioned earlier, estradiol, progesterone, pregnenolone, testosterone, vitamin D, B12, NGF, BDNF, all these sorts of things. Thyroid is another one in there. These are all things that support your brain. And then we look at the various toxins. So we want to know if you have exposure to mycotoxins. This is a common problem, often overlooked. We want to know, of course, if you have sleep apnea, if you have changes in your microbiome or gut microbiome. So these are the tests that we're looking at. And then, of course, we want to know your vascular status. So we want to look at things like your LDL particle number, your triglyceride to HDL ratio. If there's a question, you want to also look at things like advanced lipid evaluations, include things like myeloperoxidase and things like that. So all of these things are very helpful. You also, of course, want to know, what is your omega-3 index? Are you very low in your omega-3s? That puts you at increased risk. Are you good with your omega-3s? That puts you at lower risk. So when we look at these people, we look across the board to say, what is driving this process? And that's the most important piece, because you can't address what you haven't identified.
And I'm assuming that this testing protocol that you're talking about is what you call RECODE.
That is the testing part of RECODE. The RECODE is the reversal of cognitive decline, is what RECODE stands for. That is the treatment side of this. But yes, you're right. There is a testing side and a treatment side. And they go hand in hand, of course.
Right. But it sounds like a lot of tests, and it sounds like a lot of money. How much does it actually cost to do all these tests?
Yeah, it's a great point. Let me put this in perspective. If you develop Alzheimer's in the United States, the average person before they die of Alzheimer's, and it's because of nursing home costs, ends up spending a total of $350,000. It's ridiculous. It's very unfortunate. So when we do the test typically costs about $800. So yeah, it costs something, but you're saving yourself a tremendous. What I tell people is, you're going to, if you develop Alzheimer's, you're going to end up spending the average for the United States, something like that. One person wrote to me and said, no, on my mother, it was $1 million by the time they got year in, year out of time in a nursing home. So we want to keep people out of nursing homes, and we've been able to do that so far. So set aside 1/10 of that for about 2 or 3 years. And that'll be more than enough for all the tests you need, for all the treatment you need, for all the doctor's visits you need, for all the coaching support you need. And by the way, coaches, very helpful. Nutritionists, very helpful. So we have to quit thinking about this disease as a simple disease where, a protein misfolded and now you got protein clumps in your brain and there's nothing you can do about it. No, there's a tremendous amount you can do about it. And this is a network insufficiency. You need to identify what's driving it, and then you need to address those things. If you've got a chronic infection, which many people do, you need to treat it. If you've got sleep apnea, you need to find it and you need to treat it, and just go right down the list. There are dozens of these things. So yes, it's expensive. That's a very good point, but it's going to save you not only huge amounts of money, but dementia.
That's interesting, because $800 really is not crazy. I thought it would be more than that. I looked up the cost of APOE alleles yesterday on Quest Diagnostic, and it's $399 for just the one test.
Yeah.
So 800 sounds sort of on the low side.
Yeah, we do this through Premier Labs, and they include the ApoE. That is part of it. So you're right. To be fair, now that PTOW is available, we're actually working with the group that is doing the best job with that. We will be able to help people to get it for a lower price. The goal here, of course, is to make it so that everybody can have access to best testing and best treatment and avoid dementia.
In your book, you said Alzheimer's is invariably fatal. But
It
then
has
you've
been in
also
the past.
said that no one should die from Alzheimer's. So
Right.
this is a very basic question. What exactly is it that kills people with Alzheimer's? We always hear about celebrities who died from Alzheimer's,
Yeah. Yeah.
but I've never really been sure what that means. And I'm sure
Yeah.
my audience isn't that sure either. What is it that actually kills you in Alzheimer's?
Yeah. It's so sad, isn't it? So, about 45 million of the currently living Americans will die of Alzheimer's. So, it's incredibly common. It dwarfs the pandemic in terms of just total numbers. When you die of Alzheimer's, you get less and less and less able to take care of yourself, as you know. And so you end up lying around. You get a pulmonary embolus sometimes just from not moving around. You become incontinent. You get urosepsis. So you get infections in your bladder, which then get into your blood and can kill you, as you know. You get bed sores, which get infected and kill you. So all of those sorts of things that are related to chronic debility, those are the things that kill people with Alzheimer's.
Tell me how the average American diet contributes to Alzheimer's
Yeah, it's
and the
sad.
lifestyle.
Yeah. And I spent most of my life eating the standard American diet, as so many of us did. And unfortunately, as you know, really is back in the 70s that it started to switch over to much more on the processed food side. And with processed foods, we had increased sugar, we had increased salt, we had all sorts of additives. And unfortunately, these are things that increase risk. And one of the interesting points is that fructose, so high fructose corn syrup, is a bad actor because fructose, and this is the work of Professor Rick Johnson from University of Colorado. He published a very interesting paper several months ago, and actually Dr. David Perlmutter and I, as well as several others, are co-authors on his paper. What he showed beautifully is that fructose triggers a pathway such that you are trying to conserve energy because it's associated with fruit in the fall. So it's telling you, Dr. Tuakli, winter is coming, dial down your energetics, keep fat on, and you now have a situation where you're giving yourself an increased risk for Alzheimer's. You're reducing your ATP, you're keeping your fat and getting more fat related inflammation. And he did a beautiful table where he showed that you kind of go right down the list: effect of fructose, effect of Alzheimer's. And you can see how they match up beautifully. Kind of scary, actually. Now, this doesn't mean don't eat an apple. An apple's fine. You don't want to have tons of high fructose corn syrup. So, what's happened with processed food in the standard American diet? Less in the way of fiber. It's amazing how important fiber is. It's helpful for detox. It's helpful for improving your glucose status. It's helpful for improving your gut microbiome. I mean, on and on and on. It's just remarkable. And so, loss of the fiber, the increase in salt, which triggers, by the way, that same pathway as Dr. Johnson showed, the increase in glucose, the increase in fructose and high fructose corn syrup, and then, of course, additives, and the removal of some of the most important things, some of the organic fruits and vegetables and things like that. So all of these things, and then of course there are dyes in there and things like that. What's happened is the processed food industry, and certainly I think Dr. Robert Lustig has spoken about this most and eloquently over the years with his book, for example, Metabolical, which is a wonderful book. The approach was, how do we get people to want to eat this food? And so, yes, that's the old salt, sugar, and fat approach. You keep on futzing with it until you get something that the people really want. What do they call it? The bliss point. But it's not got the same nutrient value. And unfortunately, it is actually damaging. So, one of the ways, and there's in the book, at the End of Alzheimer's, I wrote a whole chapter on how to give yourself Alzheimer's. just to show people, hey, please look at this and say, maybe you're doing many of these things already. So let's get rid of those things and that will help you. So if you want to give yourself Alzheimer's, start with a high carb diet, low in good fats, low in protein, and low in fiber. That's a good start. And so metabolic syndrome, and there are somewhere around 80 million Americans who have metabolic syndrome. This includes often some pre-diabetes as well as some obesity and some hypertension and a little extra around your middle. A very, very common problem in the US. This increases your risk for Alzheimer's markedly. So these are the sorts of foods that unfortunately are driving this problem.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about how to fix it. Okay?
Yes.
We talked about what's caused, what Alzheimer's is, and it's not a pretty picture, but how do we fix it? The first thing I want to ask you, though, is I personally have not been impressed with any Alzheimer's medications. And I'm
Nor have
almost
I.
at the point where I don't want to send a patient to the neurologist because all they do is a bunch of tests and they tell them they have Alzheimer's and then they hand them Aricept or some other medication that seems to make them worse. It definitely doesn't seem to improve. And so I know that there's a new Alzheimer's medication that came out this year. What is your opinion of that one?
Again, it's important to know it does not make you better. It does not keep you the same. It slows the decline very slightly. And actually, it didn't work as well in women as it did in men. So in women, it only slows the decline by 11%, barely perceptible. As they say, it's not a clinically significant result. It is a statistically significant result, but not a clinically significant. You won't notice a difference at all.
I was going to say, in short, for the individual and the family, they really don't notice the difference.
No, it really doesn't.
The decline continues.
The decline continues. And the reason is because it's based on old-fashioned science, which is this is caused by amyloid. Let's get rid of the amyloid. So now you're not addressing all of the things that cause the person to make the amyloid. And to be fair, amyloid acts a little bit like a cytokine. It is part of the inflammatory cascade. It's about the way you are responding. So it would be a little bit like giving someone, dexamethasone. Yes, it's removing an inflammatory piece, but Alzheimer's is much more complicated than removing that one little piece. So what do you want to do to treat it, as you mentioned? So there is two pieces to this. There are 7 basics, and then there are the specifics for each person. You combine those, you're going to get the best outcomes. So let's talk about the 7 basics, and then what are the specifics for each person. So the 7 basics are diet, exercise, sleep, stress, brain training, detox, and some targeted supplements. So you want to have the diet that's worked best is called KetoFlex 12-3. It is a plant-rich, mildly ketogenic diet. So you are becoming metabolically flexible. You're able to use glucose. You're able to use ketones. Important to understand, we are only able to use those 2 things in our brains for fuel, glucose, ketones. And so we should be able to go back and forth. Unfortunately, virtually everyone with cognitive decline has lost both of those. Because of the insulin resistance, you lose the ability to burn glucose in your mitochondria, basically in your cells, and ultimately shifting to your mitochondria. You lose the ability to make and burn ketones because of the high insulin. So what we need to do then is we need to improve both of those. So we want to make people more insulin sensitive, and we also want to make them be able to become ketogenic, be able to become in ketosis. So diet, exercise, interestingly, both aerobics, strength training, are both helpful. I like something called EWOT, which is exercise with oxygen therapy, because it actually gets oxygenation far reaches of the brain. It's been very helpful for many people. Sleep, people should have 1.5 hours of REM sleep a night. They should have 1 hour at least of deep sleep per night. And then they should have a total of about 7 to 8 hours. And they should keep their oxygenation, preferably 96 to 98. But if it's dropping below 92 and it's getting down in the 80s, and even we see people in the 70s, you are probably hurting yourself at some point. So that's another piece of it. And so you want to do those things. Brain training is another one. I mentioned stress, detox, because so many of us are exposed to these various toxins we talked about earlier. Then that's the basics. And then we want to look at, for each person, a precision medicine, a personalized approach. So, do you have a tick-borne illness? Do you have specific toxins you've been exposed to? Do you have increased levels of mercury? Have you been around the California fires, for example? That's a concern. Have you had COVID recently? COVID, of course, can create a chronic state of inflammation. So, of course, it increases your risk for cognitive decline. Do you have specific pathogens? If you've got herpes, for example, recurrently, you want to treat that. There was a study out of Taiwan showing a marked reduction in people who actually treated their outbreaks of herpes, marked reduction in the likelihood of developing dementia. So all of these things can contribute to this problem, which is why you want to address them for best outcomes.
You're referring to herpes labialis, right? The cold
Yes,
sores, not the
HSV1.
genital. Yes.
Right,
Okay.
HSV1. Now, for genital, the issue is just, are you creating a systemic inflammation? So if this is something that's actually creating some systemic inflammation, that is a concern. But if it's local and just, giving you some occasional local outbreaks, that's unlikely to be a major problem.
So we've changed our diet. We've looked for all the contributory factors, and
Yeah,
obviously we need to eradicate all those. We have started taking some supplements, hopefully.
yeah.
Are there some supplements that you strongly recommend for people with cognitive decline?
Absolutely. And it depends, of course, on what the testing shows. What are you deficient in? But here are some important ones and common ones. So, for people who have inflammatory type or have ongoing inflammation, I like resolvins, these things. And of course, they came from the beautiful work of Dr. Charles Sirhan from Harvard. These are essentially omega-3 related molecules that help you to resolve ongoing inflammation. And then omega-3s themselves, DHA and EPA. And again, some beautiful work on the use of DHA along with acetylcholine by Professor Wertman from MIT over the years, showing increase in synapse formation. So I find these very helpful. And then interestingly, most of us, as you know, are deficient in magnesium, zinc, choline, iodine, potassium. Those are kind of the big five. So I tend to like to have some magnesium and zinc. Zinc supports not only your insulin sensitivity, your insulin production and exocytosis as well, the liberation of the insulin. These things are all improved with zinc, and it also improves your immune system's ability essentially to focus on specific pathogens. So all of these things can be very helpful. Vitamin D, very commonly low. We want to optimize that. We'd like to see typically in the range of 50 to 80 nanograms per mil. That's where the best outcomes have been. And then choline. I mentioned acetylcholine earlier, and again, wonderful work from Dr. Wertman over the years. And so that's another important one. And then there are others. For energetics, things like nicotinamide riboside. And by the way, there's a very interesting paper from several months ago that people may want to take a look at. It's freely available online. This is a group, what they called Combined Metabolic Activators, CMA. And they were using things like nicotinamide riboside to increase energetics. And based on the model that we proposed, over 10 years ago, it's exactly what you'd expect. Energetics are critical for getting the best outcome, and that includes the oxygenation and things like that and the blood flow. So they just used some supplements, and they got some very nice results with improving cognition.
You mentioned minerals earlier. How do you feel about PPIs? People get on omeprazole or Prevacid or pantoprazole or
Yes,
Nexium, and you can't get them off it.
yes,
And they don't seem to realize that it does mess up the minerals in, for example, magnesium
yeah.
goes down.
And zinc
So
as well, and B12. So all of these things are concerns. So all I would say is, for all these things, find out why you're having to use this. Why are you having to use the PPIs? It may be that, in fact, you actually need some betaine HCl. Maybe you're not acidifying well enough. You may need to have active enzymes, and so you can take some enzymes, digestive enzymes. That's fine. It may be that you're going to do better if you sleep with your head just up a little bit, not allowing
the
the GERD
acid,
and not thinking that you have to have it. So try to minimize those. One of our friends, by the way, my wife is a functional medicine physician. One of our friends had taken these for years and said, I could never get off them. And my
right?
wife worked with her. She adopted a more plant-rich diet. Doesn't have to be all plants, but a more plant-rich diet. You can have some pastured chicken, some pastured egg, some wild-caught fish, all these sorts of things, some grass-fed beef. These are all wonderful. But a more plant-rich diet. In her case, she was able to get off these completely and has been off now for several years.
Oh,
So
great.
often there's something wrong when you are requiring the PPIs. And you're absolutely right. They are associated with a number of neurodegenerative conditions.
Yeah, they definitely reduce the absorption of minerals, but I don't think
Yeah,
that doctors tell the patients that.
right.
And so patients aren't really aware of it. All they know is that their GERD feels better when they take it.
Yeah.
What do you think about the over-the-counter products that are advertised on the TV all the time for fixing your cognitive problems, like Neuriva, and there's a
Yeah,
few.
right. So the problem is that for most of these, there's nothing published where they've shown that, yes, we actually had someone with cognitive decline. We treated them with these things and they got better. There are a few. One is NeuroQ, and full disclosure, I am a consultant for the group that made NeuroQ, but that's why they made it, because they're actually addressing the things that are driving it in most people. Um, Nariva has a couple of things, but in my humble opinion, it's not optimal. There are others. Prevagen is one where
Right.
it has nothing
Very
that's
popular.
really helpful. They have what they have is advertising.
Right.
So that's my concern. And I think people, unfortunately, buy these things and think that they're helpful when often they aren't. All I would say is read the studies, make sure, ask for anyone who says we've got something good. Ask them for a published study that showed improvement. Also, as you know, it is easier to show improvement in people who do not have cognitive decline. So a normal person takes it and they get a little boost. Great. But people
Like
who are now
caffeine.
undergoing decline, it is harder to turn that around.
From a neurological standpoint, do you think that every postmenopausal woman who is able should take hormone replacement and the bioidentical kind, obviously?
That's such a good point. And I would defer to the real experts on this, Dr. Anne Hathaway. And we do town halls with every month. She is an expert in this area. Dr. Tuakli, who knows what she's talking about. All I can say is, as someone who studies neurodegenerative disease, it comes up again and again and again. And it's quite clear that starting early, getting on optimal BHRT is associated, and that was shown in the Stanford study, by the way, as well as others, is associated with better cognition.
So if a patient wants to do recode, and thank you for the plug, if a patient wants to do recode, how do they start? They go to the website that you mentioned earlier.
The easiest thing to do is just go to mycognoscopy.com and you can see, what to do the next. You can also go to drbredesen.com. You can go that way. We are doing this in partnership with Apollo Health. And this is a group that actually the CEO came from Apple. And this is the future. Larger data sets, more ability to look at what's driving these complex problems. This is why we work with Apollo Health. So you can go to apollohealthco.com. Any of those will get you started on this. You can then get a trained practitioner. You can then get the appropriate testing, and the testing you can get done before you even go in to see the doctor, which really will quicken and reduce the amount of time that you need to spend there to go through, because the doctor will then have all that information.
If you have cognitive decline, do you necessarily need to see a neurologist?
That's such a good point.
I know that's a hard question for you to.
Yeah,
Uh, it's like asking a pig farmer if you should eat pork, right?
yeah. Well, so, you know, as a neurologist, I always thought, yes, we're here to help. Neurologists, what we're good at is diagnostics. We are good diagnosticians. Over the years, neurologists haven't been so good at reversing these neurodegenerative conditions. What's happened is, to get a diagnosis, a neurologist is helpful. To treat the condition, it's actually better to go to a trained functional medicine practitioner, a person who's trained in this new type of medicine, where you are looking at, as you said, these are the root causes, the things that are actually driving this. Most neurologists are not doing that, and they'll just tell you, we can give you a drug that doesn't help.
So tell us about your new journal paper where you talk about how many people have been helped with your protocol.
Right. So we actually published last year in Journal of Alzheimer's Disease, and this is freely available online, paper that is showing a clinical trial in which 84% of people actually improved. I've just submitted a follow-up paper where we're now looking at people who came in very long ago, people who came in 2012, 2013, 2014, and could we show
10 years.
sustained improvement? Because that's never been shown before. If you go up and then you go right back down again, that doesn't help you very much. So we now have people who are over a decade with sustained improvement. And one of the things we learned from this is that people will often go up, stay up for several years, and then have a mild secondary decline. You have to then re-look at them, reassess them, and say, what's driving this? Let me give you an example. A woman who did well for 6 years, she had an amyloid positive scan, ApoE4 positive. So by all criteria, had Alzheimer's disease at the MCI stage. She had a MoCA score of 24 out of 30. She actually had been a nursing professor. And so she did well for 6 years. Then she started a secondary decline. She turned out to have three things that were new. Number one, she had a new exposure to mycotoxins with a new leak in the roof, actually. Second, she had a new sinusitis, which was from Cryptococcus florentii. And then number three, she had newly diagnosed and severe sleep apnea, actually. And so those three things were treated. And just as you'd expect, she went right back up again and has done very, very well. So she's now 7 years into this. And this is the sort of thing that we're seeing, that you've got to stick with it. And if you
Right.
start seeing a secondary decline, don't assume that this is inevitable. Find out what's driving that.
Find
My
out why.
hope is that we'll be able to keep people in good shape for the rest of their lives, but we don't know yet. We need more follow-up.
But at least it allows them to be independent longer. So much of a burden lessening for the family to have your loved one, even if they're with you for another 10, 15 years, but you can
Yep.
talk to them, you can interact with them. And I think that that's one of the hardest things about Alzheimer's, not cost notwithstanding, is how much it affects not just the individual, but the entire village, basically. Um,
Exactly. It just really crushes families. It can destroy family businesses. It destroys family interactions. Just having people where you can actually come and see them and they're doing better is so helpful. And I should mention that my colleague, Dr. Heather Sanderson, started something called Marama, Marama. And Marama is the first assisted living facility using this protocol that we developed. And she's getting wonderful results with her people who are in the assisted living.
that must be exciting. That's a dream.
Absolutely. And she actually talks about this. And I mentioned to you before we started the new documentary, which is called Memories for Life, Reversing Alzheimer's. It's now available on Amazon Prime, as well as Google Play and Apple TV. And Heather is in that film and talks about Marama and seeing people improve and how striking it is. And of course, having the loved ones be able to come and they know who they are and they can talk with them. It's something that we all want to see more of.
I hope you all heard that. There is a new documentary that's streaming now, and it's called Memories for Life, Reversing Alzheimer's. And it's a feature film about the first Alzheimer's patients who are reversing their cognitive decline, following the therapeutic protocol that Dr. Bredesen was talking about. And I'm going to put the link for this documentary in the podcast information. So you can click on that if you would like to see it. As he said, it's on Amazon Prime now, and it's also on Apple Play, I believe. So this is all great. Congratulations on all the hard work you've put in. I do have to say that medicine is a tough place to try to be a revolutionary or a trailblazer.
Yeah.
And so you do have people that do not believe in what you're doing. And I read an article that was written August 30th this year by someone representing the Alzheimer's Society of Canada.
Canada, yeah. I saw it.
And did you see that?
I did.
Yes.
They were
So
quite
the
critical.
title was Bredesen Protocol Offers False Hope of Reversing Alzheimer's Disease. I thought the article was very dismissive, and I'm sure that's relatively mild compared to what you've heard in the past. But the title itself, I said, okay, you're offering false hope, but at the same time, doctors tell Alzheimer's patients every day of the week, there is no hope, there is
Right.
no cure, there's nothing to be done. So I thought that was not very fair. I don't think you're, out there trying to sell, pet rocks and holy water. But it was
Talking to
interesting
patients.
that it was written, on behalf of the Alzheimer's Society of Canada. And I think oftentimes doctors do not want to open their minds and
Right.
think that there's another way to do things. We have the same problem with bioidentical hormones all day, every day,
Yep.
constant. Oh, it doesn't work. It's not been FDA approved. It's this and it's that. And yet these women are doing fantastically compared to
Exactly.
how they are when they're not on their hormones.
So, and if I could just respond to your point about the article that was written. So, first of all, they said that what we're doing is, quote, not peer reviewed, which is ridiculous. Of course, it's peer reviewed. Every one of our papers is peer reviewed. So that's just wrong. And so I actually had to consult an attorney about this. It's ridiculous because they're offering false hopelessness. They're saying that there's nothing that can be done when in fact we have patient after patient after patient who is getting better. I mean, check out the documentary or check out the papers we've published. The second thing is that they're saying that there's not enough evidence. Well, look, we're publishing paper after paper after paper. You mentioned the one where we had 100 documented cases of improvement. So what
Right.
does it take before you say, okay, I've read it, the papers are actually correct, and I'm seeing it? And look, if you don't believe, call me up or contact me and say, I'd like to meet with some of the people that actually have done well. In fact, it was one of the patients herself who said the doctors are offering false hopelessness because, in fact, there is something that can be done, and she herself has gotten much better. So I understand the point that you'd like to see it in 100,000 people and then a million people. We'll get there, but you have to start somewhere. This is what is referred to in medicine as compassionate use. If there's you remember early, for example, with HIV, if there's something that's going to work for HIV, before we had good drugs for HIV, and by the way, it took 3 to get the best result. So very much the same sort of story. You had to combine things to get the best result. People were looking for, hey, anything we can use. And for a while, as you'll recall, they were using low dose naltrexone. It actually helped
Right.
a lot of people. It wasn't a cure, but it was something that actually seemed to be helpful to people. It improved their immune systems. So, this is compassionate use of a new protocol that has unquestionably gotten much better results than any other approach to date. So, if you want to call that false
And
hope,
first, do
I
no
think you're not
harm.
understanding what false hope is.
No, as I said, I discovered you based on actually seeing someone who
Yeah.
had reversed her cognitive decline. And I looked at
Good.
the paper just like many of my colleagues. I was skeptical. What do you mean you
Yeah.
can cure Alzheimer's? And I read each line and each patient that you put there and what their scores were. And then I said, if you actually put the proof down, you've really got to stop and say, well, wait a minute. But every doctor that I speak to, this is all news. So what are you doing to educate the medical profession? Because obviously just putting papers out there is not working.
Yeah, such a good point. So, one of the things we're doing, we offer training, so-called Recode 2.0 training. We also, of course, I'm talking to people like you who get the word out to get people to understand, yes, something can be done. And we should all be doing this as early as possible. And then, of course, I've written a few books. And so the most recent one is The First Survivors of Alzheimer's. And in that book, 7 different survivors wrote their own stories. Read them. And if you can read all 7 of their stories without getting a little choked up, then you're tougher than most people because just hearing from these people who watched their parents die of Alzheimer's or their mother or father and had seen this from when they were younger and then started worrying about themselves and their children and were told often by doctors you're going to die of Alzheimer's and then to get better and stay better really changed their lives and they write about what it was like doing this. So the word is slowly getting out. I think to get the medical powers that be to make this part of mainstream medicine is going to take more trials. And we're now doing one, as I mentioned earlier, that's at 6 different sites around the country. And so if
Mm-hmm.
you check out Dementia Reversal Trial, that is the website for the trial, and see if you are appropriate for the trial. We are still enrolling people. It does give a tremendous amount of evaluation and treatment for free. So it's certainly a consideration for anyone who's having some cognitive decline.
Is there an age limit?
Yes, it's 77. So if you're over 76, yeah, then that's the upper age limit. And if you have a MoCA score below 18, so we take people down to 18 out of 30, that's actually dementia. So we have MCI and early stage dementia. But if you have
Mm-hmm.
late stage dementia and you're down at 5 or 10, then that's not part of this trial. That's going to be a separate one down the road that I'm calling SARA trials, Severe Alzheimer's Reversal Attempt. And we will just take a few people and do everything possible and see whether we can move the needle. We have seen people with MoCA scores of 0 improve, but when they improve, they don't go to 30, they go to 5 or 10. And so they do things like they can speak again, they can dress themselves again, they become continent again, things like that. But we don't yet know how to bring them all the way back to driving themselves and all that sort of stuff. So that's our ongoing research.
And people who have chronic conditions such as diabetes, are they eligible to join? Or does it just need to be people who have Alzheimer's without other chronic diseases that are obviously contributing?
Yes, good point. So for some, yes, for some, no. It depends on how severe or what medications you're on, whether you can continue them, et cetera. And so that's why it's probably best just to check out dementiareversaltrial.org. And you can also just contact them. There's a person who will talk to you and determine whether you are eligible.
And is there a closing date for eligibility?
Well, it's rolling. So when
It's
we get to
ongoing.
we will probably finish with the recruitment sometime around middle of summer next year. So it's probably going to be June, July, somewhere in there.
And we talked earlier about the testing part of the recode, and that was about $800. And
Yes.
then the curative part, I understand that it depends on what someone has to have done. So it kind of, if you have sleep apnea and so on and so forth,
Yeah.
that has to be taken care of. But in general, how much would you say it costs someone to get started on the recode program?
Yeah, it's a good point. We don't call it cure. We call it reversal of cognitive decline because that's what we can show. As we get more testing, we get more of the phospho-tau examples, for example, we'll be able to say whether this is or is not. But we don't have autopsy data to say, okay, this is gone now. So we call it reversal of cognitive decline. It certainly improves the patients and sustains the improvement. So what it costs for treatment, as you said, it depends on whether you need CPAP. It depends on whether you need treatment for a tick-borne illness. My guess is you will end up, to get optimized, depending on what you have, you're probably going to spend something like $10,000 a year, mainly the first year. Once you get going, you can do this
Right.
very inexpensively, but you've got to identify those things to begin with. So your second year may be 5,000, and the third year may be 3,000, something like that. The thing in the longer run that is expensive is to keep up with good supplements.
And just for my colleagues' purposes, how much does it cost for the doctors to do your training seminar?
Yeah, for the doctors to do the training is $1,800. And it's over 30 hours, all sorts of experts, including Dr. Neil Nathan, who's a world expert on mycotoxins, including Dr. Anne Hathaway, who's an expert on BHRT, including Dr. Chris Shade, who is an expert in the area of mercury and other toxins, including Dr. Cyrus Raji, who is a neuroradiology professor and expert in the area of imaging in neurodegenerative conditions, and on and on. So we have some really outstanding experts speaking on this.
So it's in person, not the virtual.
This is all recorded, so this is all online.
It is virtual, online.
Yes, you can do this
30
virtually.
hours, that's a lot of time.
Yes.
a
Yeah,
lot
it
of
is a lot
time.
of time, but it's a lot of information. We found this is a little bit like learning a surgical procedure. There are people who are really good at it and getting most of the people to reverse their cognitive decline, and there are people who are not as good at it and not getting very many
Right.
of their patients to reverse their cognitive decline.
Well, that makes sense. Well, Dr. Dale Bredesen, I want to congratulate you on all the years that you put in this. This seems like it's overnight, but I know you've been working on this for at least 20 years. Thank you for your dedication to the ultimate goal that we all have, which is to get rid of Alzheimer's, at least
Right.
the symptoms of Alzheimer's and the progression of Alzheimer's. If you're unlucky and you have the gene, it doesn't mean that you're destined to die from it or lose your mind, basically. I do want to ask you one last question.
Sure.
The protocol that you have, the one you've described for Alzheimer's, will it help other forms of dementia? You did mention, for example, people who get head trauma. Is there any way to reverse that?
Yeah, great point. We are just establishing the first precision medicine program for neurodegenerative disease in the world, which is at the Pacific Neuroscience Institute down in Santa Monica. So I'm very enthusiastic about that. And the idea is to look at all these different neurodegenerative diseases. Our research suggests that all of these have one thing in common. The supply and the demand do not match. So the supply has dropped too low, just like too low energetics in Alzheimer's. The demand, which is what the inflammatory part is too high. It's a different supply and demand for each of the neural subsystems. So you get Parkinson's for a different reason than Alzheimer's. Lewy body, frontotemporal dementia, ALS, macular degeneration. So we've already got our first couple of people with macular degeneration who've done well. So happy to see that. Got people with Lewy body who are doing well. Essentially, you have to modify the protocol for the unique biochemistry and genetics of each of these different diseases. And when you do that, so far it looks quite good. Now, we have very little data on, for example, frontotemporal dementia, which is much less common than Alzheimer's, but that's a tough one. We need more data on this. So the answer is there's overlap, but there is a modification that's required to get the best outcome for each of these different diseases.
On that happy note, thank you so much for joining me today. And I really appreciate you taking the time to come on my podcast. I hope maybe in a couple of years we can do this again
I
and
hope
you'll
so too.
have even more wonderful news for us because obviously your trial would have been ongoing at that
Yeah,
point and we can see how much progress we're making. Good job. Keep at it.
thank
It's
you.
not easy in the trenches.
Thank you so much, Dr. Twackley. Great to talk with you. And yeah, let's all work together to reduce the global burden of dementia.
Absolutely. Take care.
Thank you.
Today we talked to Dr. Dale Bredesen, a professor of neurology in California, about Alzheimer's, reversing it, preventing it, and essentially curing it in the sense that removing the symptoms, changing what show on an MRI, and all the tests reverting to normal. We don't call it a cure, but for people with Alzheimer's, that's essentially what it is. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. I'm so glad that he mentioned how important bioidentical hormones are, particularly for women, because there are more women who have Alzheimer's than men. If you are interested in more information about his program, please feel free to contact me. Also, consider looking at the documentary that we talked about. I will include the link in the podcast information. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please feel free to like it and also subscribe because then you will be informed when I put out more podcasts. In the meantime, I wish you the best of wellness and wisdom, and we shall continue pushing forward to make sure that we are all healthy and we can do what we can to improve the planet. So this is Dr. Twackley signing out for now. Best of luck for the new season and for the holidays.